This morning we continue our worship series, Christianity and World Religions. And if you're a guest here today, please know that you haven't missed something that we won't get you up to speed on. But we're looking at various world religions and how we might dialogue and respect and learn and understand our own Christian faith more deeply by looking at another faith teaching. So we've looked at Hinduism, we've looked at Buddhism, and today we take a focus at looking at Judaism and the Jewish faith of today. Now, each time that we've looked at a different world religion, I haven't said it, but I probably should have, that I'm not necessarily an expert when it comes to each of the world religions. It's not something that I know a great deal about Hinduism. I've done reading, I've done some research to learn about those faith traditions, and understanding Buddhism is something that has been interesting to me as well. But when we come to the Jewish faith, I feel like I have some background, some knowledge, as most of us who are followers in the Christian faith have a connection with the Jewish scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament as we've come to call them. Those 39 books of the Bible are Jewish in connection, and so we do have a basis for understanding the Jewish faith. But at the same time, I've come to realize that even though I have this knowledge of the Jewish tradition and the Hebrew scriptures, I don't have necessarily a knowledge of contemporary Judaism and how it's lived out. And that, in part, is something to explore this morning as we look at the Jewish faith. Sure, we know much of the Jewish tradition that's found in our scriptures, and we understand that Jesus was a Jewish teacher, and so we learn a great deal and know something of the 2,000 years ago understandings of Judaism. But today is practiced in perhaps a much different way than it was in biblical times. So this morning, I'll look briefly at the summary of the biblical history of Judaism. We will remember that that's a part of our history in the Christian faith. And then I will reflect on today's predominant branches in American Judaism and describe those a bit as we consider the points of contrast and conflict between Christianity and Judaism. And I'll conclude with looking at some ways that we might build bridges with our Jewish friends. The history of Israel and the Hebrew people is familiar to us, and we know of this history from our reading of the Bible, and specifically it's something that we learn of from the beginning book, Genesis. Let me read and have us read together and look together at Genesis chapter 12 and chapter 15, these beginnings of the story of Judaism. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And then in chapter 15, God brought Abram outside and said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you're able to count them." And then God said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. Thanks be to God for this reading of Holy Scripture. So this is the beginnings of the Hebrew tradition through Abram, later becomes Abraham and Sarah, and the beginnings of the patriarchs and matriarchs of the church and of the Jewish faith. That's familiar to us. We know these names. We know their stories that come to us by way of the book of Genesis. The Jewish Bible itself is referred to as the Tanakh. It's the same 39 books of the Bible, of the Hebrew scriptures that we have, but they organize them in a different way. And so the Tanakh actually refers to the three sections in which they order those scriptures. The first, the T, standing for Torah, the 5 books of Moses that begin in Genesis and then go on through. The Nevi'im are the prophets and stories, prophets like Isaiah and Micah, prophets that sound familiar to us, of course, and also includes books like Joshua and Judges and Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings. The Ketuvim are writings, the Psalms, the Proverbs, Job, and other writings that are a part of that collection. These 3 ways of putting them in collections is a part of how the Jewish faith orders them. It's a different order than our Christian understanding of the same 39 books, but they are the same writings that we look to in the Hebrew Scriptures. So the biblical history covers the centuries from creation to the primitive history of humanity to the last of the prophets in the 4th century before Christ. These Hebrew Scriptures follow the Hebrew nation in the cycles of favor and discipline and connection with God. God establishes covenants with humanity, Adam, Noah, Abraham, and Sarah, and then issues an extensive set of laws through Moses that we are aware of as well, and by which the Hebrew people were set apart as God's people to be a blessing to the nations. When they stray, God sends prophets to correct them. And there's even senses within the Hebrew Scriptures in which God sends armies to kind of redirect them, and the understanding of God working through those actions. The book of Genesis starts, in the beginning God, as most of us are aware that's the same beginning we understand in our Christian faith, so the Jewish faith holds as well. In the beginning is the creation of the earth, all the inhabitants on the earth, and throughout Genesis, the actions of God are portrayed. And then specifically, the Hebrew elements of biblical history begins with Abraham, who is considered the founder of the Jewish religion, the Hebrew people. But of course, the beginnings with Abraham is also true for Islam, and true for our Christian faith as well. So the 3 religions of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity have this connection through Abraham and through the beginnings of the story of Abraham and Sarah. The religion then of the patriarchs was simple and centered on the agreement between Abraham and God, and the religious practices consisted of sacrifice and prayer to sacred altars and stone pillars and to sacred trees. Circumcision was a defining mark of the Hebrew men in their religious community, and its eschatology was the promised land and the many descendants that were promised to Abraham. Accordingly to the biblical tradition then, there was a famine that caused the Hebrew people to migrate to Egypt to find a way forward through the famine, and they became enslaved. And Pharaoh then enslaves the Hebrew people, and we know this story of enslavement. And God rescued the people from the Egyptian in successive plaguings of the Egyptian people and the army in the Red Sea, all that story of the Exodus that is offered from the Egyptian slavery. And then at Mount Sinai, when Moses has led the people out of slavery and into freedom, God establishes the nation of Israel and names Abraham's grandson Jacob Israel, and the beginning of the people and their covenant with God as Israel. God then sustains the Israelites for 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. You recall that story of wandering in the wilderness before they received the promised land that was shared in the Genesis text that we looked at. Central to all of these events is the leadership of Moses and his teaching and his leadership role, and including religious and political and legislative and military organization that occurs. So biblical Judaism centers on the covenant between God and God's people. In fact, a good summary is given by Albert Outler in the 1950s, a United Methodist theologian who said that the Hebrew Bible is the story of covenant making and covenant breaking. That's a good way to summarize what we find in those 39 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. That covenant is made with God, but then the people often on again break that covenant. Well, I wish we had time to get into all the great stories of the Old Testament. I commend them to you. The Hebrew Scriptures are rich ground for the biblical history and the storytelling. But alas, you only give me an hour on a Sunday morning, so we won't go there. Invite me to brunch sometime. We could cover the rest of the content of that biblical history. But I do want to turn to contemporary Jewish faith and how it's practiced today and what I've learned of that difference from 2,000 years ago and the settings of the biblical time. Pastor Matt and I, along with Chris Cullington, interviewed a local rabbi, and in that interview we learned a great deal. One of the things that we learn is that the essence of Judaism can be summed up in what could be called the Torah true life. That even today, that's the focus of the Jewish faith. How do I put into action the teachings of Moses? How do I live a Torah true life? And what does that look like? Well, parts of it look like a particular diet, keeping kosher, and we're familiar with the kosher diet, and we'll see that even on our store shelves, the kosher word and understandings. For many Jews, it means not only keeping kosher, but living a moral life, trying to be a decent human being and passing on that tradition to their family. Family is very much an important part and central to the Jewish practice even today. Family and home life are highly important. And so the table on Sabbath becomes a sacred place within each home in the Jewish tradition even today. The Jewish people strive for reminders of their faith in a number of ways. Perhaps you've encountered the mezuzah. Is that familiar to you if I say that word mezuzah and the placement of that on the doorpost? Well, when we met with Rabbi Rebecca Kushner, she shared a bit about the mezuzah. Take a listen to what she had to say about that.
This is a mezuzah, which literally means doorpost. It is a mitzvah, meaning it is a biblical commandment, to put up a mezuzah. And this comes from the Shema, which is the prayer when Jesus is asked, what is the greatest prayer, or the most significant prayer? He responds, the Shema, which means hear or listen, O Israel, the Lord is your God, the Lord is one, which is usually sung, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And tacked right onto this Shema is a series of commandments that you should do. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with everything you have. And you shall speak these words as you're on your way. When you wake up in the morning, when you go to bed at night, you shall teach them to your children, and you shall mark your entrances and your exits with them, so that you shall become more aware. So the mezuzah as it is empty. So it's devoid of meaning unless you put this in it. This is called a klaf, and written on this is the text of the Shema, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, and you shall love the Lord your God, and you shall put these words of mine on your heart, and you shall speak of them, and hang them on your doorposts and on your gates. So this text would be rolled up, inserted into this hollow of the mezuzah. The mezuzah is affixed to the doorpost when you come in, heading towards the entrance when you go in, and it should be at the height where you can just reach it.
Conversation that went on from there about the Jewish faith and the practice of it, as Rabbi Rebecca shared with us that day. The first time that I encountered a mezuzah was my parents had retired. My father was a United Methodist pastor, and they'd retired from ministry, and they owned a condominium in which they purchased it from a formerly Jewish family, and there was a mezuzah on the doorpost on the entrance. And I asked my father, I was like, you going to keep that there? I mean, that's not really part of our faith tradition. He goes, yeah, I kind of like it. I like the notion of touching that, just as the Jewish family did that owned the home before us. It's an interesting tradition, and it's certainly a part of our faith to understand the Shema in that way, to love the Lord our God with all our heart, soul, strength, and mind. There are predominantly three branches of American Judaism, and Rabbi Rebecca is in particularly a part of the Reform tradition that is at the Sons of Jacob Synagogue in Waterloo. That's where she is a rabbi, as well as in Iowa City, and so it was a nice afternoon that we spent visiting with her. But there are other forms of Judaism as well that are practiced within the American traditions. There's an Orthodox Judaism that may be a typical image that we carry with us of Judaism, particularly the men, typically all in black, and they have the long curled hair on the sides of their hair and underneath their hats, and that black dress that they wear or robes that they have. In Northeast Iowa, there's a community of Hasidic Jews, Orthodox Jewish folks in Postville, and when I was a pastor in West Union, I got to encounter that experience. They are, as Orthodox Hasidic Jewish folks, they're not as open. There is some conversation that you can have with them, but not in the same way as the Reform Jewish faith that Rabbi Rebecca Kushner is a part of. The Reform Judaism tends to be more open and ecumenical and interfaith in dialogue and conversation, so it's easier to have a conversation about faith traditions with Reform Jewish folks. The Hasidic Jewish people tend to be a little more rigid in their understandings of separation of faith traditions and less likely to have conversation. But the form of Judaism that is Reform Judaism also is a bit more progressive in a number of ways. One, having women as rabbis, as teachers within their faith tradition, to have that be a practice is certainly a different part of the tradition. Girls also have their own tradition, the bar mitzvah of the young men. They have their own version of that same thing in the Reform tradition, not necessarily so in the Orthodox tradition. There's also another group that's referred to as conservative Judaism, and at first you would think that group must be highly conservative. It's in their name. They're actually middle of the way between an Orthodox Hasidic Jewish tradition and the Reform Judaism. Conservative Judaism comes out of the 1800s. It expanded greatly in 1913 in New York with the founding of the United Synagogue of America. So the theology of the conservative Judaism is more midway between Orthodox and Reform Judaism. So it does depend on who we might be neighboring with as we would visit with someone who practices Judaism today. Let me turn to a major point of contrast, and this is probably just so obvious that it's not necessarily something that you need to be pointed out to, but the major point of contrast between Judaism and the Christian faith is our understanding of the identity of Jesus of Nazareth. We understand Jesus of Nazareth as Messiah, as Christ. And among our Jewish neighbors, Jesus is a great teacher. They would refer to him as a prophet, a teacher that that conveyed the Jewish faith, but Jesus is not Christ, not Messiah for a contemporary Jewish person. For Christians, this point of departure is critical. It's uncompromising for us. We understand Jesus of Nazareth as the Christ. And when reading Hebrew scriptures, we Christians, we can't read those without seeing Jesus and the stories of our faith. But for Jewish people of Jesus' day, there was another expectation of Messiah. And so for contemporary Jewish traditions, they do not believe Jesus as Messiah. They were looking for a political Messiah, one who would overthrow Rome and return Israel to that golden period of time. And when that did not happen in Jesus of Nazareth, they did not accept him as Christ, as Messiah. How different a history it would have been without this conflicting view between Christians and Jews. But this conflicting view has led to also some of the tragic past between the two faiths, between Christianity and Judaism. It's a mark on our Christian history that we would need to come to terms with, the ethical treatment of Jewish people by Christians. We bear in part the responsibility for the barriers that are continue to be present between our faith traditions. I was shocked, in fact, in my look at Judaism, to learn of an instance and the understanding that Martin Luther, the founder of and Reform, that is Martin Luther, the great reformer, held some very hard views about Jewish people in his day. Luther wrote in 1543 regarding what shall we Christians do with this rejected race of Jews. He said, first, their synagogues should be set on fire. This was his writing. Secondly, their homes should be likewise broken down. And thirdly, they should be deprived of their prayer books in the Talmud, which is a translations or teachings of Hebrew Scripture. Long before the wrath of Hitler, Jews were persecuted by Christians, and we must come to terms and overcome that tragic past, that conflict that is between the two faith traditions. And perhaps we can overcome them by focusing not on those differences, but on points of agreement. We agree on the God of creation, on the God of Abraham. We agree on humanity being created in the image of God. We agree that God is one and that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart and soul and strength and mind, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. These are agreement points, and points that we should focus on and build upon between the two faith traditions. We can have dialogue and conversation about those connections that we have. We can believe in the chosenness of Israel and the Jewish people of God's covenant. We Christians believe that through faith, the grace of God in the work of Jesus the Christ, that we also become part of God's covenant people. We are adopted into that same covenant, not as a greater, not that we are better than, but that we are partners in that covenant keeping. Just as the Jewish people are to keep that covenant, we too live into keeping our covenant with God. To make such a claim of inclusion and adoption to God's covenant people, we must also be willing to build bridges and reach out with love for our Jewish neighbors. So I appreciate what Pope Francis, shortly after his becoming Pope, he was quoted as saying, you cannot live your Christianity, you cannot really be a Christian, he said, if you do not realize your Jewish roots. He said, I don't speak of Jewish in the sense of race, I'm speaking of it in a religious sense, and I think that interreligious dialogue needs to be deepened in this, in Christianity's Jewish roots, and in Christian flourishing and flowering through Judaism. See, I think that sense that Pope Francis is bringing is a new day for us in Christian and Jewish dialogue and conversation. How do we bridge the gap? How do we find the common good? and work together. My friends, if we can be bridge builders with other faiths, we can work for a common good in the world. That doesn't mean we can't be bold about our faith, that we can't share our faith understandings, but we can do so with respect and tolerance of others. Let us be those bridge builders in our world, in our time, but also do so with great respect and reverence. So be it, and may it be so.